Okay.
Yeah, it's great that you're here, Laurel. And Faith.
Glad to be here.
So, good evening and welcome to the dissertation writing series, Thriving the Dissertation. Tonight's webinar is Writing Style of the Quantitative Dissertation, featuring Dr. Krista Lee Chavala. Dr. Lee Chavala is the Dean of the College of Business and Leadership at Eastern University. She is also an associate professor in the PhD in Organizational Leadership program, teaching courses on quantitative research methods and serving as chair and methodologist for numerous dissertation committees. Dr. Lee Chavala has been at Eastern since 2017. Prior to becoming dean, she taught economics, business statistics, quantitative research methods, and leadership to undergraduate, MBA, and PhD students. So, Dr. Lee Chavala.
Wonderful. Okay. I
We see you in PowerPoint form, not presentation form.
Yes, I'm about to
Gotcha.
put myself in. And now do you see?
Yep. No, we see what you're supposed to see, not what we're supposed to see.
Okay. You see my okay.
We see where it says next topics and yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we'll make sure that that is not the case. Let's see. I'm so sorry.
Oh, we've done so much worse.
Yeah, no worries here.
We are all a very forgiving bunch with much grace.
Well, that is awesome because okay, it's not, let's see. Just here we go. There we go. How about that?
We don't see anything.
No.
Did you share your
see,
screen?
You don't see anything. Oh, because I didn't share my screen. I stopped sharing my screen. Okay, here we go.
You're out of practice.
I'm very out of practice. Oh my goodness.
Hi, Liz.
Okay, I'm going to share this. And then we're going to do this. And we're going to do this. How about that?
We're good.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to go back and forth between slides and between a Word document that I'm going to go through. So I'll be kind of moving in and out of the slide. So
Okay.
welcome, everyone. Hi, Laurel. Hi, Liz. Hi, Faith. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Appreciate it. I am happy to be here tonight to talk about what it looks like to both write and structure your quantitative dissertation. And since we are a small group tonight, feel free to stop me and ask questions, or feel free to wait to the end and ask questions. That'll work too. So I'm just going to go through what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to go through the four, not the first chapter of the dissertation, but the 4 other chapters in a quantitative dissertation. Usually there's 5. And I'm going to go through some key elements of those and how they can be structured. And then I'll take that approach and go a little bit deeper into some key elements around how you think about writing this quantitative dissertation in each of its individual pieces. So that's what it's going to look like. And I'm going to end up talking about time management because time management for a quantitative dissertation is different than for a qualitative dissertation, and we'll talk about why that might be the case. So let's just jump in and start with the literature review, chapter 2. And the thing I want to focus on with the literature review is something I think is really, really important when it comes to having a theoretical framework. And I think students get confused about, PhD students get confused about this, having a theoretical framework and translating that into active hypotheses that you then test. Okay, so how do you have this overarching theory up here and actually bring it down to a place where you can develop specific constructs, which turn into variables, which turn into hypotheses that you analyze? And that is, you have the overarching idea, and this is this cycle, and each different piece kind of breaks down a piece until you get to the actual test or the data analysis of your hypotheses. So the overarching theory, and then the overarching theory is broken into different constructs, or construct is a better word than concept, but they're kind of similar, that make up the theory. Then you what's called operationalize those constructs into variables by using instruments that you pick out to make your constructs kind of come to life. Then you take those variables, which are represented through instruments, and you put them together to form hypotheses. You test those hypotheses, and then you come out with either it supports your theory or it doesn't support your theory. So this is very up here. We're going to bring this down a little bit more to the understanding level with a specific example. So I was chair of a dissertation where a student was using what's called the job demands and resources theory, JDR. I don't know how many of you all have heard of this, but it's one particular theory, and the idea is that employees will have better well-being, will experience less stress, will be less prone to burnout if the demands they experience in their job, the job demands, are outweighed or counterbalanced in a positive direction by the resources they receive on their job. So that's the theory. It's kind of common sense, but a lot of theories are. That's the main theory. And then you kind of take that, if you go back to this, we're going to break that down into the constructs. So the constructs that she's talking about, you can break down the theory into job demands and job resources, and what would be considered job demands and job resources. And in her case, she really wanted to look at meetings and the idea of meetings. And she wanted to see if meetings and the demand for meetings had an impact on worker well-being. And then she wanted to see, and she was really interested in whether inclusive leadership had any kind of effect on that relationship between meetings and well-being. And particularly, she wanted to see if it mediated the effects of meetings and well-being. So the theory is the job demands resource theory. The constructs are meetings as a job demand. So that's something that the job is expecting of you. And then your well-being is the outcome. And the resources you might receive from your job, a resource is if you have particularly inclusive leadership that gives you something, and maybe that inclusive leadership outweighs the negativity of all the meeting demands that take away your time and stress you out. So she made that connection. She brought her constructs. She made her constructs related to the specific topics, but she still connected them to the theory. Now, how would she then operationalize her constructs into variables? Well, she asked people how many hours of meetings they went to in a particular week. And then she found an instrument on inclusive leadership, and then she had an instrument on well-being. And so she measured all of those things and turned them into variables. So she had her theory, the constructs, the variables. And then she worked on hypotheses around how meetings relate to well-being. Meetings are negatively related to well-being. That's what she hypothesized. And she said meetings are positively related to inclusive leadership if the leadership is having an effect on the meeting. And then she said that inclusive leadership mediates the relationship between meetings and well-being. So, but you don't need that. That's like a pretty straightforward, easy example. How many times do we only have one theory? Not that many, right? Usually we're cobbling together a bunch of different theories because we have different constructs that we want to create. And that's fine. When we create a theoretical framework, we're bringing together a number of theories and then bringing out the key constructs that we want from those theories, and then operationalizing those constructs again with variables. So one way you can do that is you can use multiple theories by saying, we have this theoretical construct and it has a couple of different elements. We have another theoretical construct that has a couple of different elements. Where's a place where one of their elements overlaps? How can we connect our 2 or 3 theoretical constructs by a few of their shared elements? So if we're looking at a social theory and we're looking at relational leadership, how do those things overlap in some way that makes them correspond to each other in terms of a theoretical construct? And then how do how can we pull out the elements to operationalize them into variables of the things that we're truly interested in. So the next thing we're going to talk about with relation to that's connecting theory to your constructs to your variables. But then I want to talk about how do you write about this in chapter 2. This always gets some confusion. And I want to encourage you, when you're thinking about your writing up your chapter 2, is to write about your constructs and then write about your hypotheses. So what you really want to do is start with defining your key constructs that you're using and going through and creating a strong definition from the literature of what the particular thing is that you're looking at. And usually you're going to start, often, not always, but often you're going to start with your outcome variable. So here, well-being is your outcome variable. And the whole point of doing this dissertation is to look at well-being at work. So you want to kind of start with what makes us have well-being at work. Where did that idea come from? How did it develop? What kind of literature has covered it? And then you want to go into your main predictor, which is meetings. Now, this doesn't always have to be the case. It can be, you can kind of go back and forth. Sometimes people start with the main predictor, and then sometimes people start with the outcome variable. So define meetings, what they are, what's the context, how are they important, how are they measured? And then you go into your mediator and define that, what it's measured in the context, etc. Make sure each one of these has a definition. Then you really want to support with evidence the relationships between the constructs. So that's the key. You don't want to stop at just the definitions. You want to, and sometimes you can define and then talk about relationships and define and then talk about relationships. But you want to support with evidence the relationships between your variables and you're going from one to the other. So first, you're going to talk about the relationship between meeting load and well-being. And what does the literature say about that relationship? Next, you're going to talk about the relationship between meeting load and inclusive leadership. How are they related? And you want to talk about the theories, and you want to talk about the evidence from the literature on how these things are related. And then when you get to this, I'm using particularly the example of a mediator because it's it's a common quantitative framework that people use. Then you want to support with evidence the idea that inclusive leadership, or whatever your mediator is, it works in between these two variables. So you need to show how the first variable is related to inclusive leadership, and then how inclusive leadership is related to well-being, and how meetings might actually work through inclusive leadership to affect well-being, or whatever your variables are or your mediator is. So when you're trying to write chapter 2, I encourage you to write with hypotheses in mind. So when you write with hypotheses, often when you look at an article, a quantitative article, and you look at the literature review of a quantitative article, what you're going to see is that you're going to see a write-up, and then you're going to see the hypothesis after that write-up. So there's a short section. Now, you don't necessarily do that in a dissertation, but you can still think that way when you're constructing your literature review. So you would say, now I'm using some hypotheses from a different dissertation that I chaired, which had to do with authentic leadership. And so it was psychological capital mediated the relationship between authentic leadership and innovative behavior. So the first hypothesis in that mediation is employee perceptions of authentic leadership are related to their innovative behavior. So you would start by defining innovative behavior because it's really kind of it's the outcome that you're looking for. And then you would define authentic leadership, and then you would talk about the relationship between them in the literature that you see. Then you'd move on to defining psychological capital. You've already defined authentic leadership, so you talk about the relationship between authentic leadership and psychological capital. And then finally, you want to introduce the third, you want to introduce the idea that psychological capital is a mediator. So you're going to talk about the relationships between authentic leadership and psychological capital and innovative behavior, and how psychological capital might be a mediator in those relationships. And you're taking empirical literature, research literature that shows all of those connections and how they happen. So if you follow this type of structure where you really write to your hypotheses, even if you're not listing your hypotheses in the literature review, it might make it a little bit easier to structure that literature review as you go along. I think I'm stuck. Oh, there we go. Okay, and at the same time, as you do that, you always are going back to the original theory. You're always saying, as the job demands and resources theory says, or as my theoretical framework that I presented earlier says, this supports this idea that job demands, if resources outweigh job demands, then ultimately a person's well-being is stronger or higher. So you're always making references back to the original theory or the theoretical framework. Okay, so that's the literature review. I'm going to move on to structuring. Mostly going to talk about structure here when I talk about the methodology chapter. So I want to sometimes it's helpful just to have a template, and I'll send you out, all of you out, these slides, and I'll send you another document that I'm going to use as well. Sometimes it's helpful to have a list. And now keep in mind, and as you might already know, chairs can differ on these things, and chairs have different ideas. And so this is my idea, but I have taken this from what I believe have been the most effective quantitative dissertations that I've seen. So I think this is a really clear way of talking about what you did. Now, keep in mind, the methodology chapter talks about what you did. It does not talk about what you found. So you're not going to talk about you're not going to talk about who's in your sample. I mean, specifically, you're not going to talk about the specific participants or like the percentages of them that were in whatever industry or whatever. You're not talking about any of that. You're not talking about the specifics of your analysis, like what you found. You're talking about what you did in the methodology. So you're going to start with a short intro and a brief description of your research design. And none of this has to be super long. The methodology chapter doesn't have to be enormously long. Then you're going to move into your research questions, and so in chapter 2, as I've talked about, you've written to your hypotheses, even though you haven't necessarily listed your hypotheses. Your hypotheses are going to come in chapter 3. So you've already built up the base for your hypotheses. So in the second part of your methodology, you're going to list your research questions. You're going to do a quick summary of all of the supporting work that leads up to your hypotheses. And you're usually going to have a diagram, some sort of diagram about how your model variables relate to each other and connect. And that might be, you might be doing a mediation, you might be doing a structural equation model. All of those, you should look at other papers to see how they create their diagrams, their models that they put into their methodology section. Then you're going to move on to your sampling and participant selection. And you're really going to want to justify your sample size. You're going to want to use the idea of effect size from other studies to show why you think you need this sample size. You're going to want to talk about how you chose your participants, what was your basic sampling frame, what's your population, what's your sampling frame, and how did you narrow your participant selection, and why. So how did you sort of delimit who you were going to select, and discuss that in detail. Then you'll move on to your instruments. And in the instrumentation section, I would tend to write a few paragraphs about your instruments, kind of talking about where they came from, describing them, talking about how they emerged, not the most exhaustive thing about them, but somewhat about how they emerged, how they've been used a little bit in the past. And then you're going to want to talk about how they've been validated by other studies. And you can talk about often the original study where they were created talks about their validity and how they were validated. And you're going to want to talk about their reliability, their Cronbach's alpha, which is usually listed. And you'll want to list several example items from your instruments. So that's usually, there's a very specific pattern to how instruments are written about. And I would encourage you to look at other quantitative dissertations to kind of see how that works. Then I would discuss your control variables, because you always need to justify why you're using particular control variables in your analysis, and what reasoning there is behind, say, including gender, what effect that might have on your outcome variable, and why you want to control for it. Then you'll talk about your data collection process, how you develop the survey, what software you use to develop the survey, whether it's Qualtrics or something else, where you went to collect your data, how you sent out the survey, what types of things you did to get a good response rate, what your response rate was. And then you'll also want to talk about how you protected the anonymity or confidentiality of your participants. So for the ethics piece. Then you'll move into what many people call data cleaning and screening. And a lot of this is making sure that you've kind of gone through your data and looked and made sure that there's no kind of messes in your data. So it might be the case that you had a 1 through 6 Likert scale and somebody answered a 7. Obviously that couldn't happen. Or, it's something crazy like that. You need to look at data cleaning, and you also need to analyze your data for missing data. There's particular ways to look at missing data, because sometimes data is not missing at random. And so you can't just go and delete all the data that might be missing, because you might lose some key pieces of your data. So you have to pay attention to that. You'll discuss that. And then you'll go into your data analysis, which is the process of what you did, not what you found. And finally, you'll end up with a summary. I want to switch over, before I go into the results, I want to switch over to another thing that I'll share with you. And I'm just going to stop sharing here. And I'll share this other piece here. Share this. So this is when I was teaching quant, the second quant course, this is always what I would use. Because a lot of times people would get their data and then they'd be like, oh my goodness, I have all this data and I actually have no idea what the steps are to take to analyze this data or to make it into anything that I could actually use. So I'll send this out to anyone that wants it, or to all of you, and then you can decide if you want to use it. So you're going to, and some of this stuff you're going to write about in chapter 3, and some of it you'll write about in chapter 4. So I'll tell you which ones. So step 1, you're generally going to be creating usable headings so you can actually see what your variables are. Then you'll code any variable. So for example, say you had people tell their gender, and you had someone say their gender, and then you'd assign a number to whatever they said. So you might code men as 0, you might code women as 1, you might code non-binary. It's always a question of whether you keep it as 0 and 1, or you code for non-binary and other responses. So that is dependent on your analysis. So you give different text variables numbers. Then you would clean your, sort of screening your data by checking each individual scale item and making sure that you don't see any obvious errors. Then you'd move forward to recoding any reverse coded scale items. So sometimes a question is asked in the opposite direction as all of the other questions in the survey. So all of the questions are usually asked in a positive way, and then maybe a negative question is thrown in there. And that's on purpose. And those negative questions have to be reverse coded so everything is pointing in the same direction toward the same part of the variable. So it's all telling you the same information about your variable. Then you need to go through your data and check for missing data and see if it's missing completely at random. So you're going to, often use a missing value analysis. There's certain tests that you can run, and you'll want to do that. Then you'll move on to computing Cronbach's alpha, which is a test of reliability, and that you'll share in. So the first 5 steps here, you're going to write about in chapter 3. That's your methodology. So you're going to write about all the things you did to code your variables, to do any of your reverse coding, to check your data for any errors, and to check for missing data. That all goes in chapter 3. Then the rest of this goes to chapter 4, and that's what we'll move to next. So you're going to compute Cronbach's alpha. You're going to combine all of your different scale items into the total variables that you'll use for your analysis. So you'll either sum or average those values. Then you'll use those variables to run descriptive statistics for all your variables and get your means, standard deviations. And then the next step is to look for outliers using box plots and other ways of looking for outliers. You'll examine the distributions of your variables using histograms so that you can check to see if there's a normal distribution for your variables. You want to create some frequency tables around your demographic variables for your categorical variables so you can easily describe your sample. You'll create a correlation matrix that shows all of the correlations for all of your quantitative and binary variables. Then you'll create scatter plots that show all of the bivariate relationships, and this is checking for linearity. So we'll take a look at what some of these things look like. And then if you're using a regression-based method, you're going to run an analysis of residuals. And this is really important because it actually checks for normality, linearity, and homoscedasticity, which is whether there's a kind of cone shape in the data, all at once. So you check those things using a residual analysis. And these are all of the things that you need to do with your data before you actually get to your analysis at the end. So let me go back to I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint, and that's the last time I'll move that. And we will move. Okay, I'm going to have to change this. Swap presenter. Okay, there we go. And we'll go back down. So I talked about showing, looking at outliers. So now we're moving into the results part of chapter 4, and I'll go over specifically how the results chapter should be structured. But I just want to show you some of the types of things. This is from somebody's actual dissertation. The types of visuals that you might see in a quantitative dissertation. So this is a box plot to be checking for outliers. We'd want to see something like this. Now, sometimes it goes in the actual chapter 4, sometimes it goes in an appendix, but usually you want to see something that talks about whether you've seen outliers in your data and talk about what you've done with them. Then you're going to want to see histograms, and those tell you whether your variables are normally distributed. And that can be important. It's good to know. It's always good to check, because if things are wildly, I chaired a dissertation with Dr. Hernandez where someone had variables that were wildly non-normal, and they had to use a completely different approach to doing their analysis than they would have used if their variables had been normal. So you have to do that analysis. You want to create a correlation matrix, and this is a decent example of one. You generally put all of the variables, including your control variables, here on the left-hand side, and then you put them all on the top as well. These are the same variables here. They're just numbered instead of the full name printed out. You want to put the mean and standard deviation And then you show all of the correlations in this type of matrix. And usually the Cronbach's alpha here is listed on the diagonal for each one of your scale variables. You'll show the Cronbach's alpha on the diagonal. So that's the correlation matrix. And then this is what's called a scatter plot matrix. So you'll do scatter plots for all of the binary relationships between all of your variables, and you can combine them using SPSS into one matrix so you can easily see whether all of, the linearity of all the relationships between your variables. And in this case, there was a lot of linearity. So sometimes people want to show every different scatter plot, but a scatter plot matrix is a useful tool to see them all together. And then finally, I had mentioned this residuals analysis, and this is something that people often forget. If they're doing a regression-based analysis, this is something that absolutely should be included. And this, you would just have your outcome variable, and you would include all of your variables, including your controls, in a regression analysis. Ask the analysis to run a residual scatter plot, and you have the regression standardized predicted value on the x-axis, the standardized residual on the y-axis, and you get a cloud of the residuals, and you would read it in the way that you're supposed to read it for a residual analysis. And this tells you all at once whether your data is normally distributed, your variables are normally distributed, whether you have linearity, and whether you need to worry about heteroscedasticity in your data. So the residuals analysis is really critical to include in chapter 4 as you're presenting all of the things that you did before you did the final analysis. So moving into chapter 4, and then I'll finish fairly quickly. Moving into chapter 4, you're going to start with an intro, and then you're going to jump right into, because you already covered all the things you did in chapter 3. So you're not going to cover the things you did anymore. You're going to talk about what you found. And you're going to start with the characteristics of your sample, who your participants are, what percentage of them have certain demographic characteristics, what percentage of them are in whatever industry. So sometimes in your survey, you're going to ask demographic questions that you aren't going to use in your analysis, because you're going to want to describe your sample and talk about why it might be a good reflection of the population you were trying to represent with this sample. Then, I went through all these steps, but this is how you would write it up. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. You'll write about your sample characteristics. You'll jump into then a discussion of the outliers. You'll move from there into discussing normality, linearity, and heteroscedasticity, and you include your residuals analysis there. You'll move from that into a discussion of your correlations and multicollinearity, which is whether you have two variables that are too connected in your analysis, and you'll see that from your correlation matrix. You'll see if there are variables that are too highly correlated in that analysis. And then you'll move into a discussion of model fit and scale reliability. If you're doing a confirmatory factor analysis, that would come in at that time when talking about model fit. Not everyone does that, so you wouldn't necessarily have to do that, but you would talk about scale reliability, Cronbach's alpha, and how you calculated that and what you did, and what your Cronbach, well, you would talk about how you calculated it before, but then you'd present the Cronbach's alphas for all of your scales. And then, you finally get to the main event. There's a lot of lead up before you get to the main event of a quantitative chapter 4, and that's the data analysis. And that's actually sometimes ends up being pretty short, because it's like you already did all of this previous stuff, and now you're running a mediation or a moderated mediation, and you're just kind of saying, here's what I found. And it might be a few pages, it might not be. And then generally it's good to end with a table of which hypotheses were supported, because that leads you directly into the discussion chapter, which is next. And we'll move to that. Oh, this is just I would say when you're doing tables of your results, you don't want to show output. So like you would never want to put SPS output in your dissertation. You want to take out the key elements of your output and create simple tables that have all of the things the reader most needs to know, which often is the effect, the p-value, if that's necessary, and the confidence interval to say whether your effect was significant or not. So let's move to chapter 5. You're really focusing on what this contributes and what conclusions and implications you can get from your analysis. So you've ended your chapter 4 with a table or a discussion of what hypotheses were supported. And now you're moving into a summary of those hypotheses, how they were supported, and you're going to tie it back to your literature review in some way and your theoretical framework. So what does it mean on a theoretical level that whether your hypotheses were or were not supported, and why? And then you're going to continue this on in another section by talking about the theoretical importance of this. Why is this important in the field? How do the findings address your problem statement? Why does it matter? And how did you address a gap in the literature? What does this all mean? Then in another section, continuing on with what this means, you're going to talk about the practical implications of your work. So how are people going to use this? And what kind of tools would you recommend to leaders or organizations based on what you find? What does it matter, and how can people use it practically? Then you'll have a section on your limitations. And this is key. There are always issues. There's always limitations. Where might your analysis, where might it have been biased? Where could biases have come in? Was there an issue with how representative your sample was? Was there a reason why your data collection might have been skewed? Was there a reason that there could have been issues with your data analysis? What types of things would have come in that would limit or bias your results and kind of affect the conclusions you could draw? And sometimes you can come back and counter those limitations. You could say, okay, this bias might exist, but it might not be as strong as you think, or it might not have actually affected the results as much as it could have for this and this and this reason. And those are really the best ways of addressing your limitations, when you talk about how the biases might have been introduced, but why they could have been mitigated in certain ways by other things that you did in your analysis. Then you'll move on to recommendations for future research. What are all the things that you would have done if you could have done everything? Or what are things that other researchers should do in the future based on the work that you've done? And then this is maybe the hardest part, because you're so tired and you've repeated yourself 100,000 times. You have to summarize yourself without repeating yourself too much. And this is one of the hardest parts of writing a dissertation. Ending with reminding your readers of what the most important results are and why they're important. So I'm gonna make I'm almost done. I'm gonna make a couple comments about timeline. So I often hear this idea that for a quantitative dissertation, a lot of the work's at the proposal stage. But when I get to after I defend my proposal, it'll be boom, 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 and I'll be done. Okay. Maybe. I think that can be true, but one thing that people don't really pay attention to is how long sampling takes. Sampling can take an excruciatingly long time. And I think people cannot underestimate how long that sampling might take. And you need to go into it with a really strong understanding that this could be a lot longer than a month or a lot longer than 2 months. I've worked, and I'm not saying this will happen, but I've worked with people who have gathered data for 8 months. So it's not ideal, but it is possible. So how do you reduce that? How do you kind of keep that from happening? Well, think about your sample early. Think about research topics for which it might be a little bit easier to collect a sample and build that into your research design. Really be thinking about, a lot of people kind of jump into this idea that they're going to use LinkedIn and social media to get their sample. Okay, but I've watched a lot of people struggle with going on LinkedIn and using social media to get their sample. Unless you have a ton of connections and you're willing to pound the pavement, which you might be. This can work. It doesn't always work, but it can. It's just be very careful about it. Think about sampling from particular groups. So try to find organizations to get approved lists of people that you can reach out to. And maybe the groups will even send out your survey, even better, because then it gets supported by someone who is from that group and who advocates for you, which goes to my it goes to my fifth point, and then I'll go back. You need advocates when you're collecting a sample. So you want to have people with connections. That's when I've seen it be most successful. You have people with connections who send it out to their connections and their connections. And then you get people who believe that your work is valuable because other people have said it was. And then the last thing about this is there is MTurk, Mechanical Turk, which is an Amazon group that you can easily go to get survey responses. It doesn't work for every set of data. It doesn't work for every research question. It can work for some, but so it can be a very easy way to get a sample. You do have to pay for it, and it's not that cheap. And it can be hard to publish with because journals are getting a little bit more, they're starting to question MTurk a little bit more over time. It's not impossible to publish with an MTurk survey, and it's certainly fine for a dissertation, but you have to think about what you want to do with your work in the future. Last thing I will say, and then I'll open it up for questions. I would strongly encourage, if you want to graduate in May, to have a full draft done, to be going back and forth with your chair by January 1st. It takes a long time to go through all those chapters and get it to where you need it to be before you graduate. And you're going to need those. That's only 2 months. You're going to need, because you need to have your draft to your committee by about March 1st to be able to graduate in May. So January 1st, to have 2 months to go back and forth with your chair before you send it out to the committee is what I would suggest. That's all I have, folks. I am open to questions and grateful for all of you being here. Hi, Dr. Hernandez.
That was great and so insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Any questions? And it doesn't even have to be what I presented. If you just have random questions, or if you want to talk about your process or have anything to add.
So I have a question. Yeah, Dr. Hernandez.
I'm sorry. Hey, everybody. I'm in my car. I just wanted to add some things to what Dr. Lishavala said. One was about the length of time for sampling, and I've become even more concerned about that. I actually am thinking that of suggesting that we seriously think about having students use secondary data. That, because they people have more money and so on. But one of my advisees on that slowed her down quite a bit, like you said, a number of months.
Yep.
Now, the other thing is, which we talk about when we critique articles, is the challenge of sampling the way we do it conveniently, and
yes.
how that there are limitations to that with the kinds of results that you may get and how the data may represent itself afterwards. So can you just talk a little bit about that, what it means when we use our friends and we go on LinkedIn and we get a sample any which way we can?
Yeah, for sure. So as you know, if you've taken any kind of quant class, you know that the gold standard is random sampling, and that's what you want to do. And the reason you want to do a random sample is because that eliminates this bias that you'd get in a sample. And the, when you think about what it could look like, say you are sampling institutions, people from institutions, leaders of institutions in higher education. And you do convenience sample, and you get you want a bunch of you want to look at deans. I don't know. You want to look at deans, and you end up with mostly women who are responding to you, right? Well, women are going to have a significantly different, depending on what your variable is, women might have a significantly different experience than men in the deanship. So you're going to have, and those are things you mentioned in your limitations, but it's better if you can try to figure out how you can have a random sample. And a random sample, one of the ways that you get a random sample, so when I did this webinar another time, we talked about different ways you can get a random sample. And one of those ways is to work off a list. And this is very difficult when you're thinking about doing sampling at all, because ideally you'd go to an organization, and the organization would be your sampling frame, and it would have a membership of, say 5,000 people or 10,000 people, right? That's sort of the ideal. And if you could work with them, they could give you a list of people, and then you could randomly select off that list the number of people, the people that you would send your initial email out to, right? And then you see what that response comes back, and then you randomly you remove those people, and then you randomly select from the list again and send that out, and remove those people, and you keep doing that until you get the best possible random sample. Now, that can happen. Does it happen? I mean, Dr. Hernandez, I don't even see people who are publishing doing much better in terms of doing a great job of getting random samples, unless they're working on projects that they're doing that are funded projects that are over a long period of time. What have you seen?
Yeah, I think that's true. It's very challenging to do, and I'm glad that to see the students here, because it's easy when you're critiquing research for your comms and whatever to say, oh, they use a convenience sample. Well, in the real world, that is what we work with. But at the same time, it does impose such certain restrictions on when you talk about the assumptions for the test that you're going to do. When you don't have a random sample, you're already at risk for not having a normal distribution. And so it affects a lot of things. And what is heartbreaking for me with students is that they do all this work, and I think for a lot of reasons, not necessarily because of sampling, they don't get what they expect to get.
Right.
And maybe you could have, but there were so many limitations given what we're working with. But as we say, I don't mean to discourage you. Whatever you find is a finding.
Right.
And what we're really looking for is your ability to be resilient and to bounce back and to figure out, if I can't use this test, then I'll have to use this test, and show us your thought process and how you arrived at what you arrived at, because that really is the ultimate learning from this dissertation experience.
That's a really good point. Like, what do we do when we don't have significant findings? We write them up anyway, and you're not going to fail the dissertation if you don't have significant findings. However, you might be very disappointed, and the way to kind of make it less likely is if you have a more random sample, and if you have a bigger sample, which is another issue, because you'll have a more likelihood of a normal distribution, and you're not going to be violating your assumptions as much if you have a bigger sample. So, Faith, I think you had a question.
Well, part of it was about the convenience sampling of, so for one of my studies, I'm actually reaching out to 20 different organizations and then getting the people from that who've been through like their professional development programs. Is that still considered a convenience study because I'm not getting the list, but I'm getting people from 20 different sources?
So So 20 different so 20 different sources is definitely can be help. So what you're doing is you're sending it out to people and you're getting people from each of those organizations to fill out the survey. Is that that's
Yes.
the goal? Okay. So it's the only thing that is complicated about that is it's kind of a cluster sample, right? So you're getting, but what happens if, you know, a bunch of people from one organization respond and only 3 people from another organization respond? Then you have an effect that's happening, that an organizational effect that's happening to your data that is hard. You know, you'd have to talk about that as a form of bias. So that's one thing, and you can kind of monitor that. You know, you can, and then you can push back to, you can push it out more at different organizations to see that you get more of a representative. Cluster sampling is definitely a way to make it less of a convenient sample, but you still have those effects. Now, if you had you could even make it more random if you had a list from the organization and you randomize that and sent out, you know, to the people in random, and then kind of did cycles of sending out the survey, you know, to people and see how they respond.
Yeah. Most of the time, they don't want to give you the list. They want to send it out on your behalf.
Yeah,
They want to hold on to that information.
for sure, for sure. And having someone who's willing to do that is already a big step. So I think there is where you really have to talk about, okay, what does it mean? What type of bias could be introduced, and how did I work to mitigate that bias in some way, right? That's the key. Like, not just talking about your limitations, but talking about how they could have been mitigated, or the effects that, it's really important to talk about the effects the biases have, because a lot of times what students do is they write like, oh, it could be biased because, you know, 20 people from this organization responded and only, you know, 5 from this organization, so I might have an effect here. But then they don't say what the effect is, right? Like, why, what type of bias would that include? Like, okay, maybe this organization is focused on, you know, specifically on drug abuse, whereas this organization is focused specifically on some other issue, and so we got people responding to one of the questions in a certain type of way. So the more specific you can be about how the bias was introduced and what kind of effect it might have caused, the better.
Okay.
Yeah, if I can just add to that. So I think with regards to sampling, and this happens a lot when we're teaching it, it's sometimes presented as though it's this very discrete thing, like you could have this kind of sampling and this kind of sampling. But really, what happens on the ground is that you could be creative with it. So like if I was doing your study, right, and I had a list, if I knew what kinds of organizations I wanted, you could randomly cluster sample the 20, right? So that's one step. You're taking one step towards showing that you're putting some kind of rigor into the sampling process. And then after you have that amount that's randomly samples within the organizations, you could decide that you want a stratified sample within those organizations based on some criteria that may be relevant in the literature review. Are you following what I'm saying, Faith?
Yeah. Because when we were talking about the cluster, I was like, oh, it can be stratified. So I'm just happy you said it, because I was like, oh, I remembered something.
Right.
Good job.
So I different. Even though you can't get the perfect situation, you say, okay, first I randomly sample these organizations from this list based on some criteria. Right. And then within these organizations, if you can, you can do random, systematic, you can do different kinds of sampling within there or not. But you just try to get as close to the ideal as you can.
Okay. Thank you.
Great questions.
Can I ask this question? Something that both of you, Dr. Luciabella and Dr. Hernandez, touched on a little earlier, and that is when what you are anticipating is not actually what you find. And last term, we had the opportunity in Advanced Quant to construct a model and to run an initial kind of test, you know, and I had an opportunity to construct a an instrument from 4 validated instruments.
Mm.
And I had anticipated, based on the literature, a mediator and a moderator, and the moderator did not necessarily moderate the relationship between, the predictor and the outcome variables. And I'm wondering, since it was such a small sample, it's only like 30, for the purposes of doing the testing, is it worth continuing with that model to, when I expanded to the larger study, with an appropriate sample size?
Was it a moderated mediation?
Uh,
Were they separate?
they were separate,
They
yes.
were separate. Okay. So first of all, moderation with a small sample is almost impossible to see.
Okay.
Like so I wouldn't take for sure moderation that not seeing that you shouldn't do it with a larger model. Because you really can't see it. Sometimes you can see mediation in smaller samples more easily. It's complicated with the moderator because it's effectively splitting your sample into parts.
Mhm.
So it makes it much harder to see. So I think I would go forward, but you might want to think about connecting making a more of a moderated mediation model. But it really depends on your research question. So that would have to be different, but that's a great question. No, I would keep going with it. I wouldn't let that particular thing, not seeing a result from the moderation, deter you, because it's really hard to see in moderation.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add to that, I think also it's great that you had this experience, because I think it could give you an opportunity, if you're thinking about going forward with this for your dissertation, to re-examine the constructs and how they were measured initially. Perhaps there might be something with the instrument, even though you say it's validated, that there might be something better or something that's really getting at the construct that you're interested in, that the present one does not. And I remember for my dissertation, I wish I had done that. I wish I had dug a little bit deeper into my instrumentation, because the instrumentation is so key to really getting at what you're trying to get. But again, I don't know if that's the case, but it does give you an opportunity to look a bit closer at that.
Okay, thank you. I was actually thinking maybe I had just chosen the wrong instrument for that construct.
It's definitely worth looking at.
Thank you.
Other questions? Well, we're pretty much at 8 o'clock anyway, so it's good to see you all. I appreciate being in the mix with all of you. It's fun to go back to my quant roots here.
Thank you. We appreciate you. And if you could just email me your slides and document, we would appreciate it. We'll get it out.
I'm going to do that right now.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye everybody. Thank you, Faith. Thank you, Dr. Lishavala. It was good.
Thanks,
What I
everyone.
got. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Have a good night.